Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 15th of July, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host today, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we're delighted to have Mark Anderson joining us from the United States. Well, it's a bit grey. We lost the football. Well, England did anyway.
Yeah, you did. I didn't.
You didn't. Okay. It's a bit gloomy, but bad things happening in the US. Mark, tell us about the Trump incident.
Well, no sooner did I finish more or less writing up and reflecting on the NATO summit, thinking that life was simple, that I got a call from a pastor friend. Hey, did you hear somebody took a shot at Trump? We don't know what condition he's in. It was Saturday at a Pennsylvania rally. And this first slide is from the Associated Press, that font of wisdom wire service in the United States, based there anyway. Authorities hunt for clues, but motive of man who tried to assassinate Donald Trump remains elusive. Since then, there's been some other speculations on the so-called shooter. We'll talk about that later. This is from the same AP article. The 20-year-old man who tried to assassinate former President Trump first came to law enforcement's attention at Saturday's rally when spectators, they're saying, noticed him acting strangely outside the campaign event. The tip sparked a frantic search, but officers were unable to find him before he managed to get on a roof where he opened fire, and so on and so forth. I won't read that whole thing. They're saying his name is Thomas Matthew Crooks, a rather interesting last name in this context. Thomas Matthew Crooks, only 20 years old. And of course, it's strange to consider that they already knew he acted strangely, and then he was able to get on a roof with all the king's horses and all the king's men in the form of the Secret Service, the Praetorian Guard, you might say, being right there. You would think a roof vantage point would be something they would have automatically closed off after somebody reported that he was acting strangely. Anyway, we have a video of the event from Fox News that then went to YouTube, so we can look at that to get a sense of what evidently happened.
Oh, that's a little bit old, that chart. That chart's a couple of months old, and if you want to really see something that's said, take a look at what happened.
Ready? Move! Up! Move! Go! Up! Hawkeye's here. Hawkeye's here. Move it to the stair. Stair, get ready. Stair, get ready. We ready? Down. Down. Are we good? Shooters down. Shooters down. Are we good to move? We're good to move. We're clear. We're clear. Let's move. We're clear.
Let me get my shoes. Let me get my shoes.
I got you, sir. I got you, sir.
Let me get my shoes, sir.
Hold on, your head is bloody.
So we got to move to the bus. Let me get my shoes.
Okay, my shoes down. Watch out.
Wait.
And as you can see there, gentlemen, Trump was acting defiant, put the fist in the air, indicating he's going to fight. And I would observe, maybe you guys want to comment at this point a little bit, it's a little weird that they didn't turn the podium mic off so as to avoid giving away any other plans, protocols, immediate intentions of what they were going to do with Trump. Because at that point, they couldn't have known exactly how many shooters there could have been and what the risk factor was. So it's a little strange they didn't turn the mic off so they would keep their intentions private in that immediate aftermath. I don't know if you guys want to comment. I can of course, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that the mic being switched on or off would have been in their control, first of all, but I mean, there are many questions to ask about the activities of the so-called Secret Service, because, you know, as you may be coming on to in a second, Mark, the police and the Secret Service their attention was drawn to the guy on the roof. And they apparently did nothing. And then there's this whole issue of why was he even given the opportunity to act defiant, as you say, because that certainly is not protocol. His head was completely exposed at that point, and I appreciate that he said he told them to wait, but nonetheless, in that circumstance, they should have been in control. So many questions to be asked about the behaviour of Secret Service there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. And yes, I also found it astonishing that you had the sniper squad up on the roof who would have been tasked to surveil, to watch the whole area, and particularly likely sniper positions. And yet, even when the crowd was shouting really quite loudly that they could see a man on the other roof off to Trump's right, there appeared to be no reaction from that sniper security team on the roof behind him.
Yeah, I'm sure the oddities will keep piling up. And of course, this issue can linger on. We can talk about some things in Extra today, and probably next week there'll be some follow-up. But continuing with this essential report in the immediate wake of the event, this next slide shows what they're saying is the suspect, Thomas Matthew Crooks, again, a kind of weird name. Suspect, it says here, came within inches of killing Trump, but left few clues as to why. And they're saying it's a high school yearbook photo of this young man. And in this particular photo, he looks even younger than 20. One is reminded a little bit of Adam Lanza, the purported shooter in the very strange Sandy Hook school shooting in Connecticut. I believe that was in latter 2012. I won't go any further than that on that analogy, but there is that basic similarity, this improbable looking shooter in terms of the person. Anyway, this is...
Mark, sorry, just to come in, to come in there. I was intrigued because very quickly online, a photograph of this young man, Mr. Crooks, appeared, taken from the school, but it was tied in with a BlackRock advert video, but it showed him presumably pretty close to his age now, whereas the photo that's been used in that article does seem to have him as effectively a little boy, but online you can see video where you can see him as he really is, which is a young man.
Yeah, you would think that they would use a better photo than that for any reports. I mean, you might do an add-on as here's how he looked when he was younger, but the main photo to tell the story, you would think they would use the most up-to-date photo possible. Anyway, continuing on, we'll walk through this, covering not all the ground, but some essential things. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a major newspaper in Southeast U.S. The photographer who captured this iconic image recounts the moment shots were fired at Donald Trump. As the FBI investigates the attack on former Donald Trump's campaign rally as an attempted assassination and an act of domestic terror, they're making that allegation now, the Associated Press photojournalist who captured the image of a defiant Trump raising his fist after being targeted described the moment shots were fired. The photojournalist said, quote, "I was right in front of the stage, directly in front of the stage. It was a normal rally. You know, I've done it 100 times. And over my left shoulder, I heard several pops. And I knew immediately," he says, "it was gunfire." And this is Evan Vucci, the AP photojournalist. This is what he said. The former president, his ear covered in blood from what he said was a gunshot, was quickly pulled away by Secret Service agents. And of course, Mike made a good point. It's strange that they let him raise his head the way they did. And at that point, not knowing exactly what the overall scenario was, that would subject Trump to additional danger. And these are some other observations. I started getting a lot of phone calls, as you might imagine, and I also placed a lot of phone calls. And Brian McLean, a good contact of mine, a TNT radio host that's based in Australia. It has a lot of U.S. hosts. Brian's based in Temple, Texas. He's an IT expert, and he has some reasonable knowledge of firearms. He understands there reportedly was no external security perimeter established, and possibly a lack of 3 designated marksman security teams. And it appears he heard there was no, quote, intel surveillance recon drone overhead. Evidently, drones are fairly commonly used, and maybe this one did not include that. Among other oddities, including the advanced threat assessment seemed to be lacking. Then a friend of mine, Alan Knutson, out of the greater Dallas area, kind of a Trump aficionado, a talented writer in his own right, kind of a blogger. He says, was this a massive Secret Service failure? The agenda not to give Trump good protection seems evident. And I didn't write this in there, guys, but he also added, could this have been drug-induced on the part of the shooter, or maybe even kind of a Manchurian candidate triggered kind of thing, where he's placed under hypnosis, triggered by an image or a phrase or a word. He then acts out a shooting, and then if he wasn't shot dead like he reportedly was, then he wouldn't remember actually doing the event. People have even ascribed that to Lee Harvey Oswald way back in the JFK days in Dallas. That's been speculated on. At any rate, Sheriff Joe Arpaio called me back. He was at the Republican National Convention. In fact, he's there all this week in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He told me, I'm angry, it says here. I'm very sad. I think he'll be okay. He kept saying, fight, fight, fight. He's a fighter. And he says that he's really anticipating, as is many in the Republican Party, Trump's presidential acceptance speech, that's supposed to be given at the Milwaukee National Convention this coming Thursday. So evidently that's when Trump will accept the GOP nomination for president. And we could go on. Like I say, there's plenty of room in extra and next week and follow-ups as things are fleshed out and as I study it more. But there were so many things that were going on since that debate where Biden really bombed out versus Trump back on June 27th on CNN, and many, many nasty things said by the Biden campaign against Trump, including that he's another Hitler. But as is reported here by Zero Hedge, Biden is now halting, his Trump is Hitler, ad campaign after the assassination attempt, and other enemies of Trump are now toning down their rhetoric. So there you go, guys. What a way to start the day on the report here.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, I'll just say I picked up on the similar images from the BBC. Let's pop the first one up, which is the one you showed, but note the headline from the BBC, bullets, blood and a raised fist. So it's almost like branding Trump, who's just been through this event, but branding him in the way that the BBC does, dramatic images from the Trump rally. But when you scroll down through these very, very high resolution images, this is one that caught my attention, complete with a circle. This was on the BBC's website with no explanation. But of course, for most people, they're going to look at this and think that this is a shot of the bullet passing his head. A weapons expert has already pointed out that basically this shot is too low for the shot that clipped his ear. But nevertheless, I was puzzled about this because essentially, what is this image? The BBC didn't explain it. I believe they're just allowing an idea to come into the public mind. Is the BBC suggesting a bullet in flight has been captured? Well, I think that's exactly what they're doing. If this is the case, then I need to ask how it was captured, because photographing a bullet in flight is extremely difficult. And we might ask, or I asked early this morning, was the bullet captured because it was expected? You challenged me on that, Mike, and we had a very interesting discussion. Yeah. And that's then produced this article for us, which we found. So, can Doug Mills' photo of a bullet and President Trump be real? Yes, here's how. So if we take out a little bit of the key stuff from this, according to Politico, Mills, the photographer, was taking photos with a Sony camera capable of up to 30 frames per second and 1/8,000th of a second, though they didn't say which one or what setting he was using. Mills is known to have spoken about why he switched to this Sony camera in the past. We now think he's using a Sony A9 III, a camera we actually covered last year with the heading, "This camera can literally stop bullets." That's a fascinating little sentence. But it goes on to say that in that case, he might have been shooting 1/8,000th of a second as it was a bright day, but the camera offers up to 120 frames per second burst and 1/80,000th of a second. Not that anyone would choose that setting unless actually planning for a bullet. So this was quite an extraordinary article. Mike, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think that last quote sums it up. How was this image captured? Somebody will have to work out what the actual odds of capturing it under normal circumstances are. It's so unlikely as to be, impossible, really. So was he using this special high frequency mode in order to get this image? And if so, anytime, as you said earlier today, anytime these types of images have been caught in the past, it's very carefully staged and very carefully set up. And so was he expecting this to happen? These are the questions that need to be asked.
Right, so to be clear to our audience, we're not saying this isn't a photograph of one bullet passing Trump's head, but at the moment there is no formal analysis, and it would appear that the BBC has just completely skated over this really important question. So we'll continue to dig and see what we get. Now, with regard to Trump and Biden, let's have a little listen to a clip of Victoria Newland speaking.
Items for Ukraine, then I cannot not ask you the question. If Trump is elected, what will happen to Ukraine? Will he agree to give Putin his demanded territories?
Well, first of all, I don't believe Donald Trump will be elected by the American people. This man is a felon. He is a liar. He is not a supporter of basic U.S. democratic freedoms and principles. He's talking about locking up Americans, locking up immigrants, hurting our economy, et cetera. So I don't think that Donald Trump is going to be president. So if that's what Putin's betting on, he's going to get a unhappy surprise, I think. That is number one.
Well, we don't know what the unhappy surprise was meant to be in her mind, but she's clear she wants Biden in order to keep the war and the killing and the carnage in Ukraine going. Let's have a little look at Biden and see what he had to say about himself.
For the next 4 years.
George, I'm the guy that put NATO together, the future. No one thought I could expand it. I'm the guy that shut Putin down. No one thought could happen. I'm the guy that put together the South Pacific Initiative with AUKUS. I'm the guy that got 50 nations, out, not only in Europe, outside of Europe as well, to help Ukraine. I'm the guy that got Japanese to expand their budget. For example, when I decided we used to have 40% of the computer chip, and we invented the chip, that little chip, the computer chip. It's in everything from cell phone to weapons.
Well, there we are. He's the man that did everything. He's got the whole world on side. Trust Joe Biden. He's thinking clearly, as of course Keir Starmer has tried to intimate. And where are we going to go? I predict more war and more war if Biden comes back into power.
Well, 100%. But my question would be, will the narrative really change that much if Trump gets back into power? I think he demonstrated in his first term he wasn't able to deal with the U.S. Defense industry, the Pentagon and so on. So I'm not sure anything would particularly change if he manages to win this election, but we shall see. Maybe we can talk to Mark about that a little bit more in extra. Now, last week we were talking about Orban's trip to Kiev first, and then to Moscow, and then to Beijing. Well, Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, is going nuts over this. We were talking about how the European leaders were going nuts over this. So I'm just going to run through this article, which is published by Armida van Rij, if that's how you pronounce her name. Orban is using Hungary's EU Council presidency to bulldoze EU norms, she says. Less than 2 weeks into Hungary's EU Council presidency, Orban has clearly shown he will not play by the rules. The EU must come up with a response. So let's have a look and see what she is saying. The role of the member state holding the presidency is to drive the legislative agenda by chairing council meetings, ensuring good cooperation with other EU institutions, and ensure continuation of EU policy agenda. So don't do anything to stop the war. Make sure you only reinforce that idea. She goes on to say, while these are Orban's trips, are technically all bilateral trips, Orban has tried to create confusion by displaying EU flags in Kiev and using the Hungarian presidency logo on promotional material for his trip to China. How dare he? While these trips are that's a repeat. So travelling to Russia to meet the head of a government under EU sanctions, which has disregarded the territorial integrity of another state, is unprecedented, she says. Perhaps more importantly, enabling confusion over whether he represents Hungary or also the EU on his trips is potentially breaching EU law. To address the challenge of Hungary's democratic backsliding, withholding funds remains perhaps the most effective lever the European Commission has. So we've got to stop giving Hungary any money from the EU. For dealing with a transactional realist like Orban, even though it has has a limited impact in the past. But instead of withholding funds on an ad hoc basis, she said, the European Commission should make a concerted, long-term and planned effort and focusing on media freedom, civil liberties, and strengthening an independent judiciary with cohesion or agricultural funds used as leverage. So this is really the response that she thinks the EU should be pursuing. She goes on, Orban is a realist who only responds to hard power. Expressions of anger on social media by other heads of government or leaders of the EU institutions will not bother him in the slightest, especially now he's gaining allies and is no longer as isolated in Europe or on the world stage as he once was. The EU needs a long-term approach for deterring and correcting behaviours by member states that undermine the European project. So I don't know what you think about that, Brian, but I just thought the rhetoric in this was absolutely staggering from this British think tank telling the EU what to do, because at all costs we've got to make sure we continue and build the war rather than, peace is not something we should be looking at all.
No, and I thought it was really excellent that you're going to use agricultural funds, which presumably in the first instance are there to help people grow crops and feed themselves. You're going to use food as a weapon for further war within the EU. But this is the European Union project, Mike. We've been warning about the viciousness of the European Union for a great many years, so I'm really not surprised at all. It's the iron fist in the velvet glove approach, and somebody who stood up for peace. They've made a journey to talk to the Russians on the basis of peace, and they've got to be stamped out of existence. This is utterly brutal. Mark, welcome to your European colleagues. I don't know what your response would be.
Well, what is the European project would be one basic question, right? That Orban is so, breaking with such impunity. What's he supposed to do? Actually, to meet with Putin and to go to Kiev, and everything he's doing sounds like much more of a logical approach to try and get a handle on the overall situation and bring a ceasefire about. I would think that they should take a more objective look at what he's doing.
I suspect they don't want to look deeper because they might find he's actually doing the right thing, but there we go. Well, of course, the war is what they want, and the vicious war in Ukraine continues. Utterly sickening if you get into the detail of what's happening on the ground. I've chosen some video clips so that our audience at least understands the basic of what's happening. And this first one demonstrates two things. We've got an attack on a train, but also there's the clarity of the surveillance video from the drone. And Russia is able to do this ever deeper into Ukraine. So a military train with armoured vehicles, and Russia strikes this with a massive missile strike of course, very precise accuracy. So this is the reality. Russia is now able to look deeper into Ukraine and to target this sort of thing. And this is the second big military convoy train that the Russians have hit, destroying a large number of people and also a large number of Ukrainian military with it. Secondary explosions going on in this clip. But then also we've got the change in Russian weapons and these incredibly large Russian bombs up to 3,000 kilograms. And this shows you what almost looks like a nuclear cloud. This is such a huge explosion. And using these immensely accurate weapons, the Russians can simply remove Ukrainian supply bases or ammunition depots in one strike. But smaller bombs are also being used to flush out Ukrainian troops in the hedgerows that form the defence lines in many cases when the fighting has moved to countryside areas. The only places that the Ukrainians and indeed the Russians can hide are these tree lines, but it's the Russians that have got these immensely powerful weapons to deal with the Ukrainian positions. So the Ukrainian casualties you can just watch happening on screen. And this is another example of what happens when these sorts of weapons hit these very narrow tree lines. And there's no doubt that the majority of the Ukrainians are going to be dead rather than injured. But we've also got precision artillery on the Russian side, and throughout the battle, the Russians have demonstrated a great advantage in numbers. So if we just play this clip here, this shows what happens with a precise strike on a building. This is in a small urban area, where, of course, the Russians are looking to take out again concentrations of Ukrainians, but also the military supplies. And if we bring this one in, some of our viewers may find this one disturbing. This is happening to both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians. But this is the use of drones to hunt individual soldiers on the battlefield. Very cruel and callous, and particularly with the idea that Western nations are watching this happen in order to increase their own performance in this field. So we see here video taken with, I would guess, infrared camera at night. But these are troops being killed by a distant observer operating the drone. And this is why NATO and the Western countries at the moment are so desperate to get in amongst this conflict, because it is so utterly horrific and brutal. But the power of the drones, of course, isn't just against troops. We've also got a fine example here of what happens with a Russian drone attack on a Ukrainian tank. And of course, we're seeing complete destruction of this particular tank with no survivors whatsoever. The Russians are also using cluster munitions. Remember, it was the Ukrainians that first used these munitions within the rockets supplied by the West. But the Russians have been particularly using this sort of weapon on wooded areas to flush out the Ukrainian defenders. And in many parts of the eastern Donbass front, extremely large areas of woodland have now been decimated as a result of the use of these types of cluster munitions. And if that shot is taken from some distance, then this clip shows what happens when these sorts of weapons are used on the forest strips, which, as I've already said, often form strong defensive positions. And the resulting fires and carnage is truly horrific. So this is the reality of the situation on the front. And of course, none of this is being reported either by the media in UK, especially the BBC or the British Ministry of Defence. We are simply told that the Ukrainians continue to win, when the reality is the exact opposite. But Ministry of Defence Twitter site, X, came up with a new plan because we're back on really Russians eating babies. This is extremely unpleasant little clip because I regard it as pure propaganda, but let's have a look at it.
Rape requires no training, no armory, no financial backing, but is as devastating as bullets and bombs.
So depressing, miserable music by the British Ministry of Defence as it attempts to pin sexual war crimes on the Russians. These are, of course, just reports that have been made through the Ukrainian government system. But if we bring up on screen the real level of casualties, now we can't be absolutely sure where we've got to, but we're pretty confident these are somewhere in the region because of the number of channels reporting it. Ukrainian dead, possibly up to around 500,000, and daily casualties, certainly over the last few weeks, as the fighting is now erupting right the way across the front as Russians move forward, up to 2,000 Ukrainian casualties per day. For the Russians, possibly dead at 100,000, and casualties possibly up to 1,000 a day. But the reality over the course of the war so far, rapidly approaching 900 days, is that the Ukrainian casualties in dead and wounded greatly outweigh the Russians because of the Russian strength of equipment. And if I just bring in this truly horrible little bit of propaganda by the Ministry of Defence against those casualties of men and women on the battlefield, the important thing for the Ministry of Defence is 287 claimed conflict-related sexual assaults or violence in Ukraine pointed at the Russian side. So I just want to say, Mike, the cynicism of the UK at the moment in keeping this war going and keeping fighting until the last Ukrainian is truly appalling. And I'm sure there's many old Labour supporters who are now deeply shocked to see that Keir Starmer wants to keep this carnage going.
And we should just make the point again, as we made last week and in previous programmes, sexual violence is a weapon of war. Can't be a weapon of war if there isn't a war. So surely the first thing to do is to stop the war instead of trying to use it to justify the continuation of a war, which is really cynical. Okay, if you like what the UK column does, you would like to support us, the place to go is support.ukcolumn.org. There are options to help us there. We do need your continuing support. Membership is £5 a month, and that really does help us. Thank you very much to everybody that is a member or contributes in another way. As we've mentioned many times, the algorithm is against us, so we need everybody to become the algorithm and share our material everywhere you can. The best place to find it in the first place is ukcolumn.org or ukcolumnextracts.co.uk. You could pick something up at the UK Column shop. Lots to have a look at there, and of course your life in their hands,
which I'm going to keep asking for every person who's a member of UK Column to buy. I will put some up in future news editions, but we've had a number of very nice emails from people talking about the quality of this publication and saying how good it is. So if you haven't purchased one yet, please do, because it's good material, it's good value, and it really helps the UK column. Now, just on the subject of Trump, I think that some people might be unaware that J. Michael Waller did two really good interviews with me, specifically talking about problems with the security services in the United States, and that includes the CIA and the FBI, and he's talking about the breakdown in performance. So if you haven't seen those interviews, get online and have a look, because I think they're highly pertinent to the assassination attempt on Trump. And coming out tomorrow, the 16th, at 1 o'clock, we've got my second interview with Dr. Michael Nels, where he's talking about Alzheimer's and what people can do in order to stay fit and healthy and to keep their mental capacity until mature years. So this is something which will be of value to all of us. And I'd also like to say that John Bodwin, who is an American who's produced essentially an algorithm which is able to process death data in the States, has obtained 1.4 million death certificates, which he's now able to process. And at 1 o'clock on Thursday, that's this coming Thursday, there's an interview with John and Debbie Evans where he's talking about the amazing work he's doing to expose what is really happening to people's health in America. And I'd also like to say, make sure you get that Saturday, the 19th of October this year in your diary, for a location in Bristol, still to be announced, which will be UK Column appearing really, really, really live. And
Yes.
we'll look forward to meeting you all there.
Okay, now in a minute, Mark will be talking about more on NATO and what's been following from last week's events. But just before we get to that, one of the things that NATO published following their major event last week was their industrial capacity expansion pledge. It's a fantastic document. Everybody will appreciate it, absolutely. And you'll particularly appreciate it if you've been paying attention to the UK column for a number of years, because we've been talking about this for a lot of years now. Here's a key quote: "We will leverage the alliance's role as convener, standard setter, requirement setter and aggregator, and delivery enabler to expand defence industrial capacity." So when we've been talking about EU Defence Union, we've been talking about its connections to NATO, we've been talking about the industrial aspect of this, which is absolutely key. So if we bring it back on screen again, they have issued a pledge, and they pledge to strengthen defence industry across the alliance, to increase large-scale multinational procurement, to accelerate adoption of new technologies, and to enhance interoperability and interchangeability. This is amongst several other things that they're pledging. And the key thing here, Brian, is what we're looking at is single point command and control. This is the term that David Ellis used to use. It's a really key point aspect of this and of the European Defence Union, so-called single point command and control and single point procurement. So a centralized organization decides, effectively controls what each member state is able to do, what they're able to purchase, and where they're able to purchase it from. And of course, this is the tying in of the military and industrial complex to these supranational structures, whether it's at EU level or NATO level, and it's extremely dangerous because it's effectively corporatizing everything that they do.
Indeed, and the lid has got to come off this at some stage. The irony is that, of course, Russia producing its own ammunition and equipment and military vehicles is easily outstripping the West combined. And of course, the problem with the European and the NATO system is that you've got too many disparate producers of equipment, and you've got this constant coordination problem, which is now demonstrating that it's full of holes. But yes, they keep pushing.
So to just give you an impression of this, each nation will be permitted to follow its own national plan, but the plans will be shared and coordinated through NATO. So could you explain to me how that works? How are you permitted to follow a national plan if the national plan has to be coordinated through NATO?
Well, as we said last week from the MOD document from 2018, we are looking for the nation state to disappear in about 30 years' time. So I think they're preparing for it, Mike.
Yes. All the way through this, by the way, probably no need to mention it, though, it's NATO, Ukraine, and Ukraine is the justification for this merging and creation of this, embryonic one world military infrastructure.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes.
And it's going to be interesting to see how close the Americans decide to be with this chaos and mayhem in European NATO. But as I've said many times, that in years gone by, Cold War, the power within NATO was invariably the US as the overwhelming power, followed by UK, followed by the Germans and the Dutch. And after that, it was people came in on a very ad hoc basis.
With the French at the bottom, right?
Well, the French were always off to one side because they didn't want to play by anybody else's rules.
Yes. But Mark, let's get a little bit more from you on the NATO summit.
Yes, I managed to sit through about 2 hours of it July 10 and about 6 or 7 hours of it July 11. Challenging to stay awake at times, but there were a number of interesting points. Of course, 75 years for the alliance. I mentioned this last week, the 12 initial countries that signed the North Atlantic Treaty. It's now 32 countries. So since the initial treaty was signed in D.C. way back when, 1949. Now they wanted to meet in D.C. again. That was the whole meaning of it. And we'll comb through this. The next couple slides are simply the daily schedule, day 1 and day 2. I'm not going to read them. They're just there for those that want to reference them and freeze those slides. Viewers can do that. And so that's just kind of a convenience there. We'll move on. Day 2 in the public forum featured this Congressman, Gerald Connolly from Virginia, a Democrat, and he announced that 31 of the 32 NATO countries now support a relatively new thing called the Center for Democratic Resistance. So they're looking at NATO not just being a military thing, but supporting democracy, being more of a political thing. And he is a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Mr. Connolly, which is a body within Congress that I didn't happen to know existed. Now, I traced it back. Here's a press release from April of 2022, and that's when this thing was sired. House passes Connolly-Turner resolution in support of establishing a NATO Center for Democratic Resilience. Today, the House passed House Resolution 831, a resolution in support of the establishment of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO to help member, partner, and aspirant states strengthen their democratic institutions and to preserve democracy around the globe. That's what they're saying it's for. The resolution was introduced by Congressman Connolly, president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Congress, like I mentioned, and Congressman Michael Turner, an Ohio Republican and a former NATO president in that same organization, the Assembly. Passage of the resolution comes ahead of the NATO's PA's standing committee meeting in Athens, Greece. That was at the time. Nothing real important there specifically. And we'll keep moving. Connolly first proposed the creation of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO going as far back as 2019, a recommendation then endorsed by the NATO Parliamentary Assembly as a whole. In 2020, the independent group of experts on NATO 2030 supported the concept in their recommendations to the NATO Secretary General. In April of 2021, the Assembly established a working group to advance the proposal concept for the center. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, speaker at that time anyway, endorsed the proposal in October of 2021 while in Lisbon, Portugal, for her acceptance of the NATO PA's inaugural Women in Peace and Security Award. The bipartisan U.S. delegation to the NATO PA has also encouraged Secretary of State Blinken, he's still the Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense Austin to build support among allies for this center. So that was a U.S. congressman's role at the NATO Public Forum. Covering this, I couldn't, of course, cover the summit directly. That's behind closed doors. NATO rolled out this public forum for the 75th anniversary largely as a PR thing. Here's what Connolly had to say, anyway, to summarize his part in this. Our commitment to shared democratic values is what distinguishes NATO from other military alliances, he says. Without it, NATO is just another military bloc, spelled bloc wrong in this case, that opposes Russia. But this commitment cannot remain purely aspirational or rhetorical. It must be operationalized. And I think he had a little more to say. There are divisions and units within NATO dedicated to collective defense, terrorism, hybrid warfare, cyber, climate change, and all these other security challenges. But after 72 years, this is going back to 2022 when this resolution was passed. So this is, I'm using somewhat older quotes, even though he reiterated this stuff in Washington this past week. But after 72 years at that time, there's not even a broom closet in NATO headquarters dedicated to democratic institution building. So this center, he says, is long overdue. So that was among the major announcements, guys, this past week. And we also have the political scene setter keynote by Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor for the Biden administration. These are all original photos I took through the wonders of screenshots. So no borrowed photos for this presentation. And I have a little bit of what Sullivan had to say. My notes were a little sketchy, so I hunted down the actual transcript. Here's his remarks in part, an excerpt. Allies have committed to collectively provide Ukraine with at least 40 billion euros worth of security assistance over the next year. And that's not just a dollar sign, that is equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery, missiles, the whole range of capabilities that Ukraine needs in this case to effectively fight and win, he's saying. Think of that in the context of your earlier report. Next, in partnership with our allies, Sullivan also announced, we will provide Ukraine with 5 strategic air defense systems and dozens of tactical systems that are especially relevant to help protect Ukrainian forces on the front lines. Sullivan added, the strategic air systems will help Ukraine as it endures a continued pounding by Russia of its energy grid with Russian missiles and drones and a continued assault on its front lines by Russian planes. So these were some, not all, but some of the main things that Mr. Sullivan announced and will continue. He also said, from our own production, we'll deliver hundreds of critical air defense systems to Ukraine over the next year as well. There was a point earlier this year when it looked like Ukraine might run out of interceptors, but thanks to decisions that Biden has taken, working with allies and partners, will ensure that Ukraine remains supplied with the air defense missiles it needs for all of the batteries that we and our allies are now providing. Together, the U.S., Denmark, and the Netherlands have begun also the transfer of F-16s to Ukrainian forces, and Ukrainian pilots will be operating in theater with those F-16s, he says, this coming summer. The summer that we're in.
The man's deluded, Mark. They haven't got a chance.
It's...
Could well be. I'm just the reporter here, and it's interesting in light of what we were showing earlier, the actual battle scenes, the overhead shots. We also have assessing the evolving threat of terrorism. I won't go into extravagant detail. The Trump assassination attempt that we reportedly heard about kind of knocked me off course a little bit. I was going to go a little bit deeper into NATO for this report. So I'm calling this NATO Part 1 of the summit this past week. Next week, I'll do Part 2. So I don't have all the details I otherwise would have had because of the Trump event. But here we have Nicholas Rasmussen. He is with Department of Homeland Security, and a NATO official, Thomas Goffis. I don't have his immediate affiliation handy, but they were talking about non-kinetic threats to NATO, primarily, guys. And by non-kinetic threats, that means malinformation, disinformation, misinformation, non-state actors, as well as state actors that would disrupt NATO's operations, that would threaten Western democracy by threatening NATO. And one thing that came up, and they were more like oblique references. They weren't real concrete, but there were these oblique references to colonizers and alternative news sources online that are upsetting the democratic system, knocking it out of whack, these kind of comments. And so one wonders which news colonizers online they might be talking about. But that came up in the terrorism context in that slide that was just shown. And here we also have just some photos that I also took to show sort of a montage of what took place. We have the Swedish Defense Minister, Pal Johnson, the Canadian Defense Minister, William Blair, and Finland's Defense Minister is shown below there. I'm not going to take a stab at maybe pronouncing his name, but there was a lot of discussion about Sweden and Finland just joining NATO and some of the ramifications of that. I'll talk a little bit more about that next week. And this was an interesting one, the NATO-EU partnership. And I've got a little bit more detail on that. One of the things that came up between Josep Borrell, who is a high commissioner of the EU to NATO, I believe that's his position, correct me if I'm wrong, and between him and the moderator, they were saying the mind is the battlefield. So some of this discussion was similar to the evolving terrorist threats, the non-kinetic threats, the malinformation, disinformation. Some similar themes came up. People are invading the networks, colonizing the minds of others, quote unquote. And this gentleman, Mr. Borrell, said it's absurd that Russia has saved the people of the Donbass region. He was the only person that even alluded to what Putin might be up to what Putin's motivations might be. But he no sooner brought it up than he shot it down. Putin couldn't possibly be defending the Donbass region. He's simply an aggressor. These sorts of things. And Borrell also mentioned 110 billion euro was recently expended for Ukraine, of which 40% is direct military assistance. And here's the thing, he claimed that in Ukraine, there are some 200 factories making thousands of pizza-sized drones, producing thousands of them a day, and each one holds 4 kilograms of explosives that can kill a tank. And my question would be, wouldn't those be among the very first things that Russian forces would destroy? So that was a little bit difficult to believe if you think about it tactically from the Russian standpoint. Now, much more could be said. We can talk a little bit more, of course, in extra about this and the Trump affair. This next slide, just to wind up, are just some notes. They said there was Q&A. I kept sending questions from time to time. I didn't get a single question answered. They even told me that there's only certain times that questions would be answered, but I didn't see hardly anyone else's questions addressed either. So the public forum's promises of addressing public questions was sorely lacking, and the public was largely just a spectator. So we'll leave it there for now, and we can talk more next week and at Extra today.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, I find that a really interesting combination. A defensive, inverted commas, military organisation, NATO, is now going to be working for peace and democracy in the world. Does that make you feel comfortable?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely not. Okay, well, should we trust British politicians? Now, previously last week, we mentioned the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. I'm going to bring him back on screen because he's been getting some press as the peacemaker with regard to Israel and Gaza. What's he been talking about? Well, apparently he stated to Netanyahu that the war in Gaza is intolerable. Well, I think I'd agree with that one. Apparently, Britain is calling for a ceasefire deal and the space for a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. I think I'll believe that when I actually see it, but this is the claim that's being made in this article around Lammy. What else can we bring in? Well, apparently he's called for the release of all hostages. He's also calls for a halt to settlement expansion in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. And he's called for a dramatic increase in aid for Gaza. So we might believe that we've got a politician here who's at least got the strength of character to stand up to Israel and say some things have got to be put right. But is this man true to his word? Well, we're going to come back to some tweets that he's previously made. This is 2017. And this is in relation to Trump. It says, read the Daily Mail story today. Yes, if Trump comes to the UK, I will be out protesting on the streets. He's a racist, KKK and Nazi sympathiser. Mike, is this the language, suitable language for somebody to get into government in a senior post? to deal with other nations, do you think?
I think you're going to answer that when you put the next thing
Well,
on
okay,
screen.
we'll bring it in. I think that this is hate speech and it's got immensely dangerous implications. Of course, we've seen what's just happened to Trump, but it'll get worse. Let's have a look at this one. Tim, I don't know who the Tim is. Tim, you are clear. I would pour whatever I can get my hands on an avowed white supremacist. My ancestors died fighting for this SH1T. I don't give two bloody hoots what your apologist bottom thinks about it. That's me being polite. You lay down with dogs, you get fleas. So there's some really, really nasty stuff inside this man, but he's apparently the peacemaker on the national stage. This was an NPR report saying that British Parliament member David Lammy discusses why he opposed Trump's visit. This is back in 2018. And when we come to this one, it really takes the biscuit, because this is 2019. Donald Trump has tweeted out that there has been no president in the history of our company who has been treated so badly as I have. The Democrats are frozen with hatred and fear. They get nothing done. This should never be allowed to happen to another president. It's a witch hunt. And Lammy has said 4 US presidents have been assassinated. Snowflake. So think about that comment in relation to the assassination attempt that we have just seen. And I'm going to suggest that this man is not fit to be in post, and there's going to be major problems. I think we just have to watch him for long enough.
Indeed. Now, the election is over, thank goodness, and that means that Ofcom gets back to work, because they weren't able to do anything, apparently, during the election, all kinds of special rules and so on. So online safety is on the agenda once again. So they're switching that back on. And I wanted to just quickly remind everybody what Labour's position is on online safety. Of course, the Online Safety Act has passed, the legislation is in place, and Ofcom is back to work to start implementing it. But if we look at the Labour Party's manifesto, they said this: Labour will build on the Online Safety Act, bringing forward provisions as quickly as possible and explore further measures to keep everyone safe online, particularly when using social media. So they are talking about the Online Safety Act as being only the beginning. And if we go back to pre the election, in fact, if we go back to pre the passing of the Act, we should make the point that Labour was absolutely behind the idea of legal but harmful. This concept was dropped from the final legislation because it was so controversial and so draconian and so totalitarian that nobody was prepared to accept it. So when they say they're going to build on the Online Safety Act, many people, including myself, believe that this means the return of this type of idea, the idea that content which is absolutely legal but which they happen to not agree with should be systematically censored from the internet. Now, as I say, Ofcom back in business, and they are continuing to build their infrastructure in order to protect children, they claim, from harmful content online. So in order to protect children, I just want to remind everybody what the tech companies will have to do. First of all, they'll have to impose robust age checks. Now, of course, this isn't about checking the age of children. This is about checking the age of everyone. So this is all about digital ID, because, of course, in order to check the age of anyone on the internet, they've got to identify them and absolutely establish their age to decide whether they're a child or not. Companies are going to have to bring about safer algorithms to make sure that children don't get access to certain types of content. But again, if you want to browse these platforms anonymously, or you don't want to identify yourself, then you're going to get the presumption will be that you're a child, and you will get the safer algorithms. And effective moderation will have to be imposed as well. This is the difference that Ofcom claims is going to be made. So children will not normally be able to access pornography, they say. So it's not going to stop them accessing it at all. It's just going to be not normal. There you go. Children will be protected from seeing and being recommended potentially harmful content, not harmful content, potentially harmful content. So we've got to be sure that we understand what that means. Children will not be added to group chats without their consent. But surely the problem here is that children are being groomed to take part in group chats. So I'm not sure how that works. and it will be easier for children to complain when they see harmful content, and they'll be more confident that their complaints will be acted on, apparently. So that's all good stuff, isn't it? No, right, okay.
I'm at the speechless stage, Mike, because this is such nonsense.
Yes, so I'm mentioning this again because the consultation ends on the 17th of July, so in a couple of days' time. This is a consultation on protecting children from harms online. If you search for consultation protecting children from harms online, you will get to see that, and maybe you might add to the consultation. And we're just going to end this section on online safety with a clip from Mariana Spring, who's been talking about the shocking discussions that have been going on social media with respect to the Trump assassination attempt.
What's being said?
I think perhaps it didn't come as much of a surprise that there was a huge wave of disinformation, conspiracy theories, speculation, hate, mainly because this is the first attempted assassination of a former US president that we've ever witnessed in the social media age. It was coming from all sides of the political spectrum, but I think what surprised me was just how mainstream a lot of the conspiracy theory rhetoric became. It was being recommended to people's feeds on X, and the average person was really getting involved. In terms of what was being shared, there were lots of people suggesting, building on kind of legitimate concerns about alleged security failings, and suggesting, hang on, something's not right here. But then they took it that step further, saying maybe this is staged. They'd point at the extraordinary real pictures and say, there's something not right here. This must be a bit of a setup. Lots of those people were anti-Trump supporters. Their posts reached millions. There were then also some committed Trump supporters who suggested that this was part of some kind of shady cabal, a group of people, the deep state, they often refer to them as, who did this on purpose, that the CIA ordered it. There's no evidence to support any of these ideas, but that didn't stop them spreading so quickly across X in particular. And it was on X that it felt a bit like an earthquake, where political supporters on either side were doubling down in their echo chambers, pushing out this kinds of content. And the rest of us were left kind of scrabbling around, trying to work out what was going on. The BBC contacted X and they didn't get back to us.
Okay, Mariana.
So anyway, we always like to leave a bit of comedy to the end of the programme, and that hopefully got many of you laughing.
Yeah,
it certainly got Brian laughing.
They did. I wonder how many times I've contacted the BBC over the years and they never get back to me. They never answer the question. But be fair, what a lovely dress.
Okay. Well, we'll leave everybody.
We'll leave it on a happy note.
Yes.
She was wearing a lovely dress, I think. Okay, thank you very much to our audience today for joining us, wherever you are in the world. And a huge thank you to the people who are members of UK Column, because it's your generosity that keeps us going. So thank you very much for that support. We can only do what we do with your support. So thank you. We will be back. Where are we in the week? Monday. We'll be back on Wednesday at the same time. If you're a member of the column, stay with us. We'll be with you for Extra in a few minutes, and we'll include the clip with Debbie advertising her full interview with Mr. Bodwin. So join us for that. Thank you.
Bye-bye.